Well, he has his fingerprints all over the tennis media world. My guest, Tom Patient, and he is in London right now. I'm in Los Angeles, and we're making this happen. He is a producer for ATP Media. I love the work they are doing right now. In fact, as we're taping this, I've been watching so much of your content from Miami Open. But on this podcast, the Honest Living Podcast, I'm Bryan Fenley with the USTA as a commentator and with Tennis Channel. We are going to share Tom's story in a unique way. And as you know, Tom, we're going to look at your career going from film and other things related to tennis into where you are now, but loved looking at your personal life too. So we're going to get sort of a full-on look of who you are. I know you've seen some of these. It's your time, and thanks so much for doing this.
Oh, thank you for having me, Brian. Honestly, it's an absolute pleasure. Yeah, no, look, I mean, I said I just kind of want to be as open and as upfront as possible. As we were saying, I mean, I think everyone's got a slightly different route into the world of TV and sport, and it's always very interesting, I find personally, to lots of hear other people's stories and how they get to where they are. So, and for me, it kind of feels like, well, the journey, I mean, it never really truly ends, I think, but it's certainly starting to, I suppose, from where I started, I suppose it's fair to say now that it's starting to pay some sort of dividends in terms of career and where I'm going and what I'm hoping to achieve going forward.
As we go into what you were just saying, I want to start here. What makes something interesting to you?
Um, Very good question. What makes it, again, it's different to everyone, right? I mean, to me, it's I suppose looking at the question broadly, I suppose it's more about how something that resonates and something passionate about. I think it's something that you're passionate about. Um, you'll have a natural affinity or sort of a pull will naturally pull you in the direction of something that you find interesting. Um, I suppose, yeah. I mean, it's hard to say, isn't it? I mean, but I think for me, obviously, I mean, speaking of, if, in terms of looking at where I am now, I mean, I grew up in a very sporty family, came from a strong sporting family background. Sport was always a big part of my childhood and upbringing. So that's something that's because I've been exposed to it for such a long period of time from such a young age. That's something which I'm very interested in, and that's just stayed with me throughout.
If there was part of your childhood, you're talking about your upbringing, Tom, that you could slow down, like you could stop and freeze and go back to that moment, or make sure that it could stick around longer than it did just with the way time works, what would that be?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, there are certainly moments when I do wish I could wind the clock back and go. I mean, obviously, the younger you are, the less cares you have in the world, right? I mean, so I mean, it's more about. I mean, when looking at the ages up to about 12, where you're just concerned about playing and having fun. I think in terms of a time where I could stop it, though. I'll probably be honest. It was so. I mean, again, this is part of my story. When I was 8, I just turned 8 years old. My family, being British, we actually emigrated to New Zealand and
Oh,
lived out there for best part of 2 years before coming back to the UK. But those 2 years that I had out there, that was amazing. I mean, there's a whole different approach to sort of life and schooling out there that's different to the UK. And actually, that's prior to that, I played a lot of football, but then football wasn't soccer, wasn't a big sport in New Zealand. But that's when I learned to play rugby, and that became the main sport for the rest of my life. So that's, I suppose, and a time of learning to play a sport there. Um, that was a big, and as we'll talk about New Zealand as a country, it comes to have quite a sort of bearing on the direction that my life has taken a little bit. So so I suppose that's a period in time that I wish I could go back to and wish I could, yeah, certainly relive.
That impact that you felt being in New Zealand and living there, and you kind of hinted at this, Tom, but how to this day do you feel that that experience impacts you, your outlook on life, the way you proceed with your life based upon what you learned from those days?
Yeah, no, good question. I mean, I think, I mean, it's probably one of the biggest things, life-changing things I think people can do, right? Is that moving or living in a
Yeah.
new country. I mean, granted, it wasn't a completely different culture. New Zealand's got a lot of similarities to America and obviously the UK. But I mean, it's still, you literally couldn't be further from the UK, you're halfway across the world. So I think going to a new country where you didn't know anyone from a young age, being forced to like forget your friend groups that you were with back then. There wasn't no WhatsApp or Facebook or things back in those days. I'm
Yeah,
not that old, but I'm old enough to not have had them.
sure.
Um, yeah, I mean, you have to almost start again. And I think actually one of the lessons I learned and is sort of how to get on and adapt to new environments, take on new challenges, new schools, new friends, new sports, new life. Um, and I think those sort of skills that you don't, they're not, you don't really classify them as skills, but I suppose they're sort of experiences that I suppose mold you in a way that help you in later life. And I certainly think that's certainly come true for me, certainly in my adult life, in terms of being able to get on with people and work with different people and be in new environments and stuff. And I think because there's a familiarity there, I suppose, or something you can draw from. So I suppose that's one of the biggest sort of impacts, I suppose, that living in New Zealand or living in another country has on you as they're growing up. And I think it's easier as a child than it is for adults as well. I think children perhaps can adapt a little bit easier than adults somehow.
And then you use the word, adapting, and based upon the different, I guess, ways in which your career has taken you from film to tennis media, you've had to have some idea of adaptation and noting that there's some really interesting different things that or that have shown themselves in your path, where it's fascinating because it's not so much linear, but it's like it just shows that you can take on different challenges no matter what those are. And when you think about what you're doing now, Tom, as a producer at ATP Media, for you to be at your best in what you do there, what has to happen?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll try and answer the sort of first half of the question. Like, in I think because yeah, you're right. I mean, my career hasn't been linear by any stretch of the imagination, and actually, I suppose there was times, and this is something which actually I suppose if anyone's like people that are listening and watching, I'd like to sort of say because I've been, I suppose, this affected me because in the sense that there were times where I think, oh, I should have just taken the easier road, or I should have done that because that was an easier route to take. For example, like a lot of my friends had quite a lot of linear careers and it's had that sort of natural progression, whereas myself, I'm quite naturally inquisitive and I wanted to give it. I suppose I'm more. I don't mind taking risks, you know. And I think obviously the earlier you do that in your working life, because even when you're in your early 20s, you're still an absolute young pup, you know, you don't know anything much of the world. And I
Sure.
certainly throughout my 20s, I've certainly had to learn a few lessons. But actually, I mean, that's given me sort of scope and possibility to immerse myself in different fields and work out what didn't work, what I didn't like. And by doing those things, and trust me, I've done a fair few of those like rubbishy jobs and stuff in between,
Yeah.
and that things haven't worked out. That it does sort of, in some way, steer you. I'm a believer in this. It does steer you into more on what you do like and what you do want, not just from your work, like your career, but also like what you want from life a little bit as well. So that's certainly, there's been a run of experiments I've definitely run down my 20s, but they've always stayed true to me in terms of what I wanted to do. I suppose that's the important thing to say. In terms of how that then links to my career now and the
Sure.
skills and what I've picked up and learned along the way? Well, I think it's probably, I mean, everyone can say this, and I'm sure a lot of people do. You hear it all the time, don't you? They say, oh, I wouldn't be where I am if those things hadn't had happened. And it can be a bit of a cliche and almost make you want to vomit a little bit in your mouth. But actually,
Yeah.
is that there is some truth in that. I mean, I wouldn't, I'd say that I probably could have found an easier way to get there, but I have, and I'm glad that I have, because I definitely wouldn't have had the opportunity to work at ATP Media were it not for the experiences that I'd had prior to that, both in the world of sport and film. So yeah, does that kind of answer your question?
When it comes to getting the broadcast on,
Mm,
where are you able to really tap in to your strengths and your brain power
mm.
to allow your skill set to come out the most when it comes to showtime?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it goes back to what we talked about a little bit earlier. It's my ability to work and get on with people. I'm not a, I mean, again, this is as much about your personality as it is about your like credentials in terms of what you've got written down on your
Sure.
CV. I think to do this job, like a lot of jobs really, but in terms of working in TV production, um, as I said, you have to work with lots of different people from lots of different walks of life, backgrounds, languages, barriers, cultures, everything. And it's about bringing everyone's skill set or individual jobs that they do and sort of bringing them all together to get things going. And in order for that to happen, you need to be able to work with people and to sort of speak to them in a way that, again, it's something that can't really be taught, but in a way that you've got to have a sort of a ability to sort of understand what's important to them whilst also understanding what they need to do to help everyone else to get the job done. Because essentially when you, as a producer or in any sort of TV, whether it's a broadcast, whether it's a film, whatever it is, you are working towards this end goal, right, which is the end product. And there's lots of different sort of layers in terms of getting there. But fundamentally, what makes that all tick and work is the people that you're working with. And so I'd say working with people and understanding them and being able to be friendly, have a laugh, and just to make everything a nice positive environment as well. You wouldn't believe me, like there's a negative environment, which I'm sure everyone sort of experiences at some point, can have a sort of a really negative impact, and it can sort of trickle on onto the end product as well, which you don't want. So you keep people happy, then I think everything else makes your job
When are you
easy.
happiest?
I'll be honest, like, I mean, in my work life, yeah, when I'm in the throes and in amongst a project, whether it's like during a broadcast, I do, in a weird way, I do quite like it when things can sometimes go a little bit awry or go a little bit wrong, and you have to find a way to get yourself out of a mess. Sometimes it could be not of your own making. And you can be as the most well-prepared person in the world, but I mean, until something happens, which it can invariably do in broadcast, you have to be reactionary, you have to think fast, and you have to find a way to deal with the problem. And I suppose that certainly can certainly keep you awake and keep you on your toes. I do quite like that, but I think much the more satisfying thing is overcoming it, and once you get over the other side, and then you can sort of relax. I do quite like that side of it sometimes, but I suppose generally just working with everyone to an end result, like in a work capacity, in a personal life capacity. I like playing sport. I like exercising. I like that feeling of um, like having like done something, where it's a long run or whether it's been to the gym or played sport. I like that feeling afterwards as well. So I suppose I'm happiest when I'm sort of outside as well. So yeah, I mean, because it's no point working all the time if you can't enjoy life a little bit. But yeah.
That is a set of words to live by. Tom Patient is with me, ATP Media. I'm Bryan Fenley. You laid out, Tom, how you enjoy the thrill of problem solving and work, and you're very good at it. Your resume speaks for itself. How good are you at problem solving outside of work and looking at family and friends and the way in which you're able to channel those talents into that world that you live in too?
Yeah, I think again, I mean, it goes back to my person. I think your personality, or I don't want to keep harking on about, but I think that who I am as a person, um, there's no guises that I put up when I go to work. I mean,
Sure.
I think the who I am in real life. I mean, that's who I am. I like to think I'm conscientious, sort of very upfront, open, honest person, and I try to live by that mantra in my work life and in my personal life. In there, I don't see any distinction. Just don't distinguish between the two. In terms of the relationships, like for example, my family, like I mean, I've got a younger sister, and then my mom and dad they were still together. Like this, we've always been a very sort of close knit family. And and actually with my wider family as well, both on my dad's side and my mum's side especially, very sort of close knit. And I like that. That's important to me for sure. I mean, I'm still a single man. I'm not married or anything like that. I suppose if I'm going to be honest, I mean, because everyone can talk about how good they're, how great they are, but I mean, I'd certainly say that there's probably an element of me being better with relationships in work than there is in my personal
Sure.
life in terms of from a relationship standpoint, I suppose. Um, I think there's always been an element for me of I mean, I'm quite a sort of goal-oriented person, and
Yes.
I think there's an element, and I've seen of quite ambitious, quite driven, and I think there's an element of me wanting to get my ducks in a row before entertaining the idea of settling down and having being in a long-term relationship and
Yeah.
having a family, which are certainly things which I want, but I at this time I don't think it's conducive. So that's but that's an area which I could certainly improve on. I think for sure, if I'm going to be honest about it.
I like the way you broke that down because I'm with you there, Tom, because I think that I get along like you with those who have the shared ideas of ambition and like wanting to go somewhere, wanting to make something out of their lives. And at work, you are surrounded by people who are doing that. And sometimes, based upon the amount of time that you throw yourself into your work, there might not always be a whole lot of time first and foremost to have with others, because this is as you know, this is a business that is very time consuming, and at times you can get yourself in sort of a bubble, and it can be a community, and then when you step out of it, it's like, oh yeah, there's this other life I have as well. And so it's so hard to probably create that balance. But how do you handle sort of the constraints of travel and what you're doing on the grounds when you're on site at tennis tournaments, and then trying to make some time for yourself, which can be hard given that this is the industry that we signed up for?
Yeah. Yeah, very good question. I mean, I think one thing I'd say is that I think obviously, yeah, the realm of TV, it's notorious, right, for being sort of long hours and things like that. And in some ways there actually really isn't an escape from it. So I suppose the one thing I'd say is that I think you've got to know that before you start that is part of the requirement. But I think on by the same merit, I think things have changed and have improved a lot, not just in the world of TV broadcast, but in all workplaces, haven't they, over the years? And there is a lot more sort of like flexibility, obviously with the 3-day working week now, which is very much a common sort of practice here in the UK, and as it is in many other parts of the world. Because everyone realizes the importance of having a work-life balance. I mean, again, being a producer or in the world of TV, there aren't those sort of set 9 to 5 working hours, as I said, as we know, we're working across different time zones, different countries, and so on and so forth. That doesn't necessarily sort of apply to us all the time. However, I mean, speaking from my own experience, I mean, ATP Media, I mean, the ATP is great. I mean, there's very much sort of they understand certainly the importance of everyone being happy, and I'm working. I'm essentially in my role now. I've got my work to my own schedule. I mean, you're working by the project, and there's a lot of trust that's put on you on that. So as long as you're doing everything which you need to do to make sure that the job is being done well and correctly, then you are given freedom in terms of if you want, in terms of the hours that you choose to work. Obviously, if you're on site at a tournament or doing it from the studio, then obviously you have to be there, and they can be long hours. But again, you then sort of make up that time afterwards. You know, when people are back to work, you can be having your time off to do what you want to do then. So, I mean, from personally now, I mean, I think that's a side that's really great. And by having a little bit more sort of autonomy over your own schedule, and the hours you work is really helpful actually, and it really helps you, not just your personal life and what you want to do outside of work, but just in terms of actually making you more productive at work as well.
Yeah.
Because there's no,
Yeah.
I mean, there's nothing to say that if you work 10 hours and someone else works 5 hours, doesn't mean the person that's worked 5 hours hasn't worked as hard as the person that's
Yeah.
worked 10 hours, right? They might have been better at managing their time. Obviously,
Exactly.
that can't say that's a blanket rule for everyone, but I certainly think that you learn to be more efficient with your time, and I think that's certainly something that's promoted, and which I like, and that makes then, and that's the question, being able to deal with the ridiculous time zones that you're working across, or the countries that you're in. You do find a way of being able to even that out in the long run, I think. And I think a lot of it's not just, there's a lot of sort of production companies in a lot of sport now that are going that way, and I think that's good.
What traits do you have, Tom, that make managing your time and getting the most out of time so accessible for you in doing that?
Um, I mean, yeah, I mean, I'd say I'm quite disciplined. I wouldn't say, again, I mean, I'm not sort of blowing my own trumpet here, because there's probably people that work far harder and far more disciplined than me, and there's no question about it. But I mean, that it's all relative, right? I mean, I think I can, if I know I have to stay late to get something done, then I'll happily do that. If I know I have to get up early to do something, to get something done, to make it accessible for the person who's in America or China or wherever, then I know I will do that. I, in terms, so I mean, I suppose it's knowing as a trait. I suppose it's I suppose in some ways it's a weird, it's a conscientiousness about it, in the sense that I don't want to, I want to make sure that if I was in their position who's waiting on me, I'd want to try and make sure that whatever they were needing was received sort of promptly and to a good standard. I suppose I want to make sure that the work I do is done well, and so I don't want, and also, like, I mean, God, I mean, I can procrastinate enough things in my personal life, which I
Sure.
definitely do. But I mean, I don't want that carrying over into work. It's sort of like as well, you know. So you want to make sure that if you do something, you do it well, and that's just, I think it's not necessarily a personality trait. It's more smiling. It's more just the way it's brought up. You know, if you do something, do it with honesty and to the best of your ability, and then yeah, and that's just the way I sort of try and manage that, I suppose.
When you say like you're able to pick up on the needs of others and you want to make sure that everything gets done over time, Tom, what sort of like hunch or gut feeling do you develop to sort of know what's coming in this business and what that looks like, to say, okay, I've been in this for a long enough time where you notice like your intuition for things has sharpened over the years with your experiences?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, I suppose there's, I mean, yeah, I mean, technology now is the thing, isn't it? I mean, it infiltrates every workplace.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no job that's safe or that isn't at risk from being sort of done by a sort of a computer, right? Yeah, I mean, it's a tough one. I mean, I certainly think, yeah, I mean, the TV industry is, I mean, we're past its golden age, I think, in terms of the years of when it was, I mean, when it was big, sort of the 90s, 2000s, big money for, I mean, it isn't as much money, I would say, in the industry as a whole now, I suppose, but I mean, in terms of people making a career out of it, I mean, but I think what is being realized now, and again, there's people far more qualified to speak on this than me, but I mean, I certainly think what we're seeing now, and speaking from a tennis perspective, is, and actually from sport, a lot of sport, is that sport's big business in the sense that it draws massive eyes across the world, no matter what sport. I mean, obviously tennis is up there, but I mean, it's a tool, I think, for whether it's for sponsorship and advertising and whatever comes with it. I mean, you know, from especially from the Super Bowl, for example, I think there's a lot of things that could be learned from sports in terms of growing their audience participation and sort of revenue, seeing what they do with the Super Bowl, and the NFL just in general. But yeah, and American sports for that matter. But I think the challenges now is that I think, which we have as broadcasters, is the advent of, and again, seen this in film as well, which I've kind of seen the side to, is streamers and streaming. It's becoming more popular by the day, by the year. And there's I suppose the threat to broadcast TV is that it will surpass that in the coming years. How soon that is, it's hard to say, but there is evidence and there's statistics to say that definitely is happening now and quite quickly. But I mean, like a lot of industries, I mean, yes, it can be seen as a threat, or it can be seen as an opportunity to adapt. And I mean, I think no business in the world will ever rest on its laurels. And I have worked business that have rested on their laurels and just tried to do things the way it's always been done, and hope that, I mean, for any successful business, I mean, again, so I mean, I used to work at Hawkeye, for example, and think how big they are, and the guiding mantra from them, they started off in cricket, which I started off in, and then tennis, and then they've infiltrated every sport on the planet now, you know, and they are probably up there being one of, if not the biggest sports technology company in the world. And their mantra, or their sort of philosophy, was that it is always looking to sort of evolve and adapt and try and find other things to do, knowing, I mean, whilst they had a monopoly on a lot of sports because no other technology could keep up with it, they knew that they weren't going to be in that situation forever, and they'd have to find other ways and to grow the business. And I think that's testament to the founders, but I suppose also Sony, who own Hawkeye, in terms of making them a huge profitable venture for their company. So I suppose that, I mean, that's from my experience. I mean, that's something which I suppose you could apply and encourage all businesses to do, especially in the world of sport and TV. I'd say you've got to look at new ways to adapt and to perhaps incorporate streaming, which is nothing. And to not fight against these things, but to work with them to try and benefit everyone. Again, that's far easier said than done. But I think that's a challenge which I see but it's one I think is going to be exciting for the world and the world of TV, and certainly in sport TV for over the next 5 to 10 years for sure.
Well, I've been watching a lot, like on tennis TV. That's sort, you know, a lot of your ATP media. So you and a lot of other tennis media outlets are doing such a great job. People are always going to want to watch the matches. It's just how. And you guys have been able to really think outside the box and be forward thinking. And as we wrap up this conversation, Tom, you talked about how you got to look ahead to technology and plan for that. I think technology has to play in for what Tom Patient is doing. I think, Tom, you're ahead of the technology, and everybody says that they're racing to try to stay with technology, but just understanding the ability for you to adapt, which we talked about, I think is a core principle of you. And then we also began with asking you about what makes things interesting to you. And I think we accomplished our task in this conversation in talking about what makes Tom Patient interesting. So I appreciate you doing this. Tom Patient, producer, ATP Media. I'm Bryan Fenley with USTA as a commentator and with Tennis Channel. Thanks so much, Tom. And I look forward to our paths crossing soon. I know you've got some traveling coming up.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
thanks for allowing us to peek into your life.
Not at all. No, my pleasure. And yeah, I'm sure we'll meet up at some point. Yeah, over the coming months.